All right, so if you know anything about me, you know that I've been doing a bunch of solo shows about the 90s. And I figured since this is close to the end of season 2, I would do a quick Q&A about 90s stuff and just personal 90s stuff from my perspective. And so I grabbed a few of the questions about the 90s and about me personally in the 90s. And I'm going to do some of that right now. So let's get into it. I'll try to not to bore you for too long. Let's go to it. So 90s Q&A, here we go. What is your favorite 90s show? Should be difficult, but I think it's actually pretty easy. Star Trek: The Next Generation. Now, technically this is an 80s show because it came out in 1987, but the 90s seasons were the best ones. That's when things really started to kick off. The first two seasons, first season particularly, there's a few good points, but it felt like the cast didn't really come together. It felt like a lot of stuff was a bit sketchy. The pacing was really slow. Like these acting sometimes was melodramatic. It was a little sketchy in the first season. Second season it starts to work itself out, but I think third season, we're getting to 89, 90. That's when things really start to rock. So, and it went on for 7 seasons. So all those 90s seasons were crazy. Why was Star Trek: The Next Generation the best? I would say Patrick Stewart. He's Professor X. Patrick Stewart, legend. He was part of the Royal Shakespeare Company in the 80s under John Allen, who has a book. I think I have a book right here. Playing Shakespeare. It's also a show. Go on YouTube and type in Playing Shakespeare. John Barton. John Barton. Playing Shakespeare. Look who that is. That's Ian McKellen on the cover. Okay? That's Ian McKellen on the cover and Judi Dench. This was legit. Patrick Stewart was in that group at that time. This dude could act. So you had him as the head. He was the head of the show, and he was crushing it. He was fantastic. You had that classical acting. They had a lot of classical music. There was tons of concerts. So you're getting some culture, and the writing was stellar. So Star Trek Next Gen, I can't tell you everything that was good about it, but I'd suggest check it out. I think you can watch it on Netflix right now. I'm pretty sure. So binge watch that and be like, holy crap, this is still pretty good. And then also realize that they're walking around with like iPads and all manner of futuristic stuff that exists today, but did not exist in the 80s and early 90s. So I'm going to give it to Star Trek for being transcendent in their attitudes and in their thought processes and in the way they made that show. Phenomenal stuff. I'd say Star Trek Next Gen, favorite episode. Okay, next question. What is your current favorite 90s social media account? Now, that's a good one. There's a lot of people, a lot of stuff involved there. But I'm going to say 90s Kid for Life. 90s Kid for Life. You can see him on TikTok. You can see him on Instagram. I find that he does a lot of short form content that is just to the detail correct. Like he understands the vibe. It's like kind of low budget if you want, but he understands the vibe. He hits on the small details. One that comes to mind right now is like you just came home from the pool and like literally he's got you like falling asleep in the back of the car with a towel still over your head after being in the pool all day, then throwing like some kind of bread together with some kind of meat thing in it with some kind of fake cheese, like just cheap food that you might have totally loved as a kid. You can't eat as an adult because it's actually terrible for you. He understands that stuff like perfectly. So he does it well. He captures the innocent side. Even when he's rapping along to a song that no kid has any right to rap along to. It's like, I want to get you into Georgia Dome on a 50-yard line. Like he nailed it. And we were all listening to those songs in the 90s. We all were watching movies we shouldn't watch, and we were all listening to music we shouldn't have been listening to. And he got that innocent side of it, like, you're just a kid, and you're singing along and whatever. Love it. 90s Kid for Life. He's awesome. Check him out. That's my favorite. What 90s band do I remember most? Well, I would say that Soundgarden was the one that I listened to the most. I probably listened to Soundgarden as my favorite band. I had their albums. I listened to them a lot. But I don't think that's the one that I would say I remember as 90s, because Soundgarden somewhat transcended the 90s. Like when you think of famous bands and stuff, you think of Soundgarden, and Chris Cornell continued to have bands. He was in Audio Slave. He had some solo stuff with Timbaland. He was in Temple of the Dog in 90s technically as well. But so he sort of transcended the 90s situation, and Soundgarden is still fairly well known today. I would say band that I think of when I think 90s is actually Silverchair. They're an Australian band. They were teenagers at the time. I think Soundgarden used to make fun of them because they were teenagers whose moms were their manager, And they were like, your mom's your manager. But they were 90s exclusive, I would say. I don't think they even had an album that was like, they like had a huge high. They did have an album after the 90s. I think their last album came out in like 1999, where they were like Silverchair. And then they're like, oh, we're like 30 years old now. Let's make another album in the 2000s. They did that. But I remember them as a 90s exclusive band. I saw them twice in concert, actually. And I chatted with Dax Henry, who was on my podcast recently. Check out that episode. Dax Henry was awesome. He was inspired by Silverchair. So we chatted a little bit about that. Their albums evolved every time they came out. There was Frog Stomp and Freak Show and Neon Ballroom. And I felt like there was something different in every one of those albums, but it had a very grunge, 90s grunge sound. And they were teens. They were a little older than me at the time when they came out. And that was artistically inspiring for me, because it's like, wow, these guys are like 15 or something, and they can be in a rock band, like a world famous rock band. It kind of made you feel like you might be able to do anything. And the songs were cool. Say what you like. Tomorrow was cool. And Gabriel's Son. Pure Massacre. I always liked Pure Massacre. So they were cool. But like it's not a sound that I think really still works today. It was a 90s thing. So I think of Silverchair when I think of 90s bands. I don't know. Who do you think of? But that's who I think of. What's next? Next question. What concert experience do I remember most? And I mentioned seeing Silverchair a couple of times, but that's not what I remember. I actually saw over 100 bands, maybe something like 150 bands, if you include all the opening acts and all that stuff. A lot of times there was 3 bands before the band you saw. So I saw quite a few bands. Maybe 50 legit concerts that was like, this is the headliner bands. So yeah, it's a pretty big deal. Lots of festivals. So there's a lot to choose from. However, the answer comes quickly. The answer comes easily. Craziest concert experience, most memorable concert experience that I had in the 90s was Woodstock 1999. Whoo-wee! That was a show. That was a show. And specifically either being in the mosh pit at Korn or the mosh pit at Limp Bizkit. 2 very 90s bands. They were new metal, rap rock, whatever you want to call it. They had it all. The mosh pit was the wildest I'd been in. The Woodstock concert itself was the wildest environment. It was like no limitations. Like someone took the training wheels off of a concert. They're like, just show up and there's going to be bands and everything else will work itself out. And it didn't work itself out. And that was crazy. It's just like, you're like a wild animal city of a few 100,000 people. Whew, totally crazy. Naked people everywhere. Lawlessness of all types. And the mosh pit in these shows, particularly Korn and Limp Bizkit, was like being in the ocean. It never stopped. Didn't matter if there was music playing. You were just floating around. Don't think you have control over your body, because you don't. And you are just in it. You are just in it. And then when the band starts to play, it's like the ocean turned to lava and you were being erupted into the sky. It was totally nuts. And then, oh, by the way, riots. there was some riots. And that's really 90s style. Like the meanness and extremeness and anger. There were some riots. So yeah, Woodstock 1999, craziest 90s experience in terms of a concert that I'd ever seen. Totally nuts. Totally nuts. Totally nuts. I think that last question kind of leads into my last answer leads into my next question, which is what was the worst part about the 90s? Well, that extremeness. Not necessarily the worst thing. It's a lot of fun, but it can be different. I think of too the fashion. I know the fashion's returning. I know it's not quite as bad as I recall it to be. But the fashions were pretty gross, to be fair. It was like kind of like either being a bum or like the worst don't match colors that were still sort of a carryover from the 80s. It was I don't know. It was a mess. It was a mess, but that was not the actual worst thing. It's the PC answer, I guess. I would say the actual worst thing was the meanness. I'm going to say there was some pretty straightforward meanness, lack of tolerance for new ideas and differences between people, which actually is a lack of freedom. And I don't like that. You can't be free. Everyone has to think the same thing and do the same thing and be the same. There was a lot of that in the 90s. It was from a different direction. I think people say that now that that's what's happening, but I ultimately feel like it's a little bit less now than it was in the 90s. Their day-to-day lifestyles, like here's the right way to do things, and you're a piece of crap if you don't do everything exactly. If you don't fit in at exactly perfectly, then people are going to be directly evil to you. Not a lot of tolerance for new ideas or differences. I'd say it's something to be aware of even now. Anytime in history, it's important to be like, hey, do you have any tolerance towards new ideas, even if they don't quite match with you? Is there any truth to them? And then also be willing to look at your own ideas and go, is this working? Is this reality, or am I just on some kind of ideology? Super important. And I feel like being mean, like a push towards everyone being a certain way, or else it's fine to be evil to them, basically, just really mean and doing evil things to them. It's terrible. It's bad today, and it was bad in the 90s. And I didn't really like that. I think it's a bad attitude. And I felt that the 90s were stifling to certain points of view, certain ways of life, and not the top. I would say that would be the worst thing. Hence the riots at Woodstock. Well, there's a lot of bubbling anger, a lot of under the collar hate, if you want to put it that way. So at the time, really in that concert, just to be honest, the rioting seemed like the next logical step. Was like, okay, if we can do what we want, let's blow off some freaking steam. It really seemed like I was not surprised at all. People wrecked everything, blew stuff up. I'm like, that makes sense. That makes sense. In the 90s, it made sense. Being completely nuts and having no rules and all of that made perfect sense. And it actually isn't right. So yeah, it should give you some ideas of how the 90s could be. And I'd say that was probably what was bad about them to some degree, even though everything that's bad has a good side. Is a little rough. And I think, again, certain points of view, certain lifestyles and stuff would have found it really, really hard. Whether if you're an artistic person or you're part of a community that people call marginalized communities, or outsider community of really any kind, it could have been rough. Could have been very rough for you. You'd have felt like there's no place for you in the 90s, more so than now. Now there's maybe it's gone the other way. There's no place for people who were generally perpetuating a lot of that in the 90s. So maybe it'll balance out. Who knows? I'm not a social scientist of any kind, so I couldn't tell you, but I don't love that. I think acceptance of other people's lifestyles, even if it's very different from yours, is important. And I don't think that only goes in one direction. So it was pretty one-sided, I felt, in the 90s. I didn't like that. Okay, enough rambling about that. Next question. What from the 90s would you like to see return? What would I like to see return from the 90s? You know what? I'm going to go a little bit, not esoteric, but I'm not just going to say, I'd like to see Star Trek. It's a lot of 90s stuff's already back. So I'm not going to talk about shows. I'm not going to talk about music. I'm not going to talk about a food or anything like that. I know those are the fun answers, but I'd say the freedom. I just talked about how that was too crazy, but And that was stifling in the 90s, but also there was a ton of freedom. And particularly, I'm talking about freedom from screens, from phones, from the internet, social media, freedom, just a little bit more freedom, boys and girls. And what does Damien Haas always say? Boys, girls, and non-binary friends. See, I don't want to leave out your point of view. Okay, no, what from the 90s would I like to see return would be the freedom, particularly from screens, phones, social media. And although, look, the internet, phones, they can be amazing. They can be a great tool. For a million reasons, they're good. I'm not saying technology's bad, man. We shouldn't have any technology. Let's be Amish. Nah, I don't think that's the case. Things go forward. Technology goes forward. It's generally good for mankind. I'm fine with it. But it can seem stifling. It can seem like you're stuck with it. You're always chained to the thing. It feels like you have to be connected to something all the time, tracked by something all the time, tracking everything, keeping in contact, you know, even addicted to the thing at all times. And I know Kurt Cobain said, here we are now, entertain us. But maybe we don't need to be entertained 100% of the time. Here I am making YouTube videos right now, but saying we don't need to be entertained all the time? Meh. Maybe we don't. And I'd like to see some screen detox from the 90s. Like, we just didn't have it. You'd watch some TV, whatever. Maybe you'd play video games too much. Fair. We had that in the 90s. But when you leave the house, all of that stayed in the house. You would not bring a television with you. You were out and you were about, and that's it. People couldn't get a hold of you unless you had like a pager or something, like a beeper. Crazy. So I'd like to see some screen detox and phone detox and just freedom be infused into daily life a little bit more. That was an interesting vibe in the 90s. It feels good. And when I think back to it, it's very nostalgic to be like, wow, I really didn't need any of this stuff at all. And life went on just fine. There is something to that. Anyway, moving on. Ooh, final question. Big one. Important. Which Ninja Turtle would you be and why? Whew, that is a big question. Also, technically, Ninja Turtles was an 80s thing. It came out in like 1988, 89 as a cartoon, as a comic book. I don't know, like 85 or something like that. Yeah, the Ninja Turtles came out in like 1985. It's an 80s thing. However, it continued on into the 90s. TV show continued into the 90s. All the cartoons. It continues to this day. There's a new Ninja Turtles comic out right now, and it's awesome, by the way. So just the artwork anyway is crazy, crazy good. Look at some of the covers and stuff. Really wicked looking Ninja Turtle stuff coming out right now. So it's still legit. It still exists. You can buy Ninja Turtles toys right now. You can go to Toys R Us and buy Ninja Turtles toys. So I will say I was into the Ninja Turtles in the 90s, probably more than the 80s, because again, I was a little kid. So there's a certain point where you're not aware of stuff. You know what I mean? Okay. So why though? What Ninja Turtles would I be? That was the question, right? Okay. I would say back in the 90s, Michelangelo was probably my guy. Super funny. I love the nunchaku. The whirling nunchaku. Come on. That was legit. I actually would take like my keys for my house or whatever and put them on something like a longer keychain so that I could whip it around like a nunchaku. Love the nunchaku. Big favorite. I'd love to say Leonardo because I also love a katana. And this dude, he was the most skilled. He was the leader of the group. He was the most level-headed. But I think realistically, Michelangelo and his nunchaku, maybe a mix of the two guys, because I can be very level-headed on one side of the spectrum, and I can be very extreme and insane on the other side of the spectrum. I don't know. Do you see this? You see this hairstyle? Not exactly the Leonardo hairstyle, right? So if I could mix the two guys, is that fair? Can I do that? It's my podcast. I'll do what I want. It's Ninja Turtle. If I could split the difference between them, be a hybrid of both of them, then that would be my answer. Michael Nardo. Michael Nardo. That's my favorite Ninja Turtle. That's who I would be. And yeah, I think that covers the question and answer for today. So thank you for indulging me in this one. I appreciate it. Like I said, I will try to jump on. It's the second season is basically finished. So it is what it is. I'm going to find some new people, some interesting conversations to have, and continue to talk about the 90s probably in my solo shows. But I'll talk about other stuff too. It's not just about the 90s. That can get tired and boring. But there's so much to talk about there, and I've been thinking about it a lot, so I've done a lot of these shows. So I'll jump on, maybe do another question and answer about a different topic or another solo show, or we might have some new people on anyway. If some good conversations happen, I might post some stuff. But second season is technically officially finished as of right now for the summer. And like I said, I won't leave you hanging, but expect things to be a little different during that time. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. Like, I never tell people to subscribe or like the video or any of that stuff because I don't see why you would have to be told that. It's been around for like 25 years or something. You know how it works. You know how it works. It helps me. If you want to help me out with it, please do. If you don't want to, fine. It's fine. Really, it's okay. One way or the other, let me know what your favorite 90s stuff was. Let me know if there's anything you want to talk about. If you'd like to hear me yammer on. If I know about the topic and like the topic, I'll do it, but no promises. Okay, so that's it. That's my 90s questionnaire. Take care. All the best. Ciao, ciao. Goodbye. See you later.